Is God really in charge? Does God really care? Of course, I say. Until there is real unpleasantness in my life. And then I maybe start to doubt. Until I see some of those refugees from Myanmar on the television and some of the torture they've had to endure in Malaysia, and then I start to doubt. Until I get a glimpse of some of the greed and corruption that is endemic in some of the key organisations in our world. Is God really in charge? Does God really care? We're starting a series looking at the second half of the book of Genesis, chapters 27 through to 50. And we are going to see over the coming weeks, we are going to see everything that we see on our television screens today. In these chapters, we are going to see everything that we see in our own lives and in other people's lives. And we are going to see, and I'm giving the game away, we are going to see that our God is in control. And we are going to see that our God is amazingly good. Genesis, that word means beginnings. And as I've said in my Bible, Genesis 37, I measured it, we are exactly a millimetre into the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible. Hence my first heading, God's cosmic plan, 1 millimetre in. What's happened so far in Genesis? Well, you can probably tell me as well as I can tell you. What's happened so far? Well, Genesis 1, 2, 3, God has made this amazing creation. He's put men and women in charge of it to rule under his good rule, and men and women have said no. That's the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, isn't it? We know best. We don't want you telling us what to do. And that theme develops in the early chapters of Genesis. The stories will come to mind. Cain murdering Abel. Wickedness getting completely out of control. Wickedness getting so much out of control that God has to act decisively. And in a sense, he starts again. He sends that flood. That dreadful flood. We're tempted to call it a children's story, but it's not. It is devastating. Everyone is wiped out apart from that one family. And so the world starts again. But the world continues. We know best. We don't want you telling us what to do. And then Genesis 11, Genesis 12, an extraordinarily significant thing happens. God calls an individual man called Abraham, and he says, now you are going to see me actively start to put in place my cosmic plan. And you might remember, he made 3 promises to Abraham. He said, you're going to have many descendants, you're going to have a land to live, and you guys are going to be a real blessing to the whole world. 3 promises, but 3 tiny problems with those promises. First of all, Abraham and Sarah couldn't have children. Secondly, they were nomads. They had nothing in terms of where to live. And thirdly, they were not great people. Actually, they were very sinful people. How could they be a blessing to anyone? And in any case, what do those promises look like in practice? My brother used to live in Dubai, which is an extraordinary place. But 80 years ago, Dubai was just a struggling little port on the edge of the desert. Today, Dubai is incredible. Whether it's good is a different question. But Dubai is extraordinary. There are these breathtaking skyscrapers. There is the most extraordinary wealth. With no exaggeration, you walk into some of the hotel foyers and they are literally dripping with gold. The technology is astounding. But had you described today's Dubai to those fishermen, those port people 80 years ago, they wouldn't have had the faintest comprehension of what you were talking about. Abraham didn't have the faintest comprehension of what God was promising. But we do. Because God, in his goodness, has revealed to us in the rest of the Bible what those promises eventually will look like. What will those promises look like? What is God's cosmic plan? Well, as we well know, it is not to reform the earth. It is to create a new heaven and a new earth, where God himself will physically be with his people. In a place where there will be no more suffering, no more death, no more unpleasantness whatsoever. A place of fulfillment and contentment and security. And central to the new heaven and the new earth will be the perfect rule of the Lord Jesus Christ. This is God's cosmic plan, which he has revealed to us in the first millimetre. What else has happened in the first millimetre? Well, Abraham has had a son whose name was Isaac. Isaac had twin sons, Esau and Jacob. And Jacob had 12 sons, one of whom was called Joseph, who, and I finally got there, Genesis 37, Joseph is now 17 years old. So, God's cosmic plan, the first millimetre in. My second heading, God's revealed word, flouted again. I think the key verse in this chapter is verse 20. Joseph has gone out into the fields to find his brothers. Verse 18, but they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Verse 20, come, let's kill him and throw him into one of those cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Joseph was the second youngest son in the family. Jacob, very unwisely, the father made him his favourite, and Jacob gave him this special coat. Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber are very grateful indeed to Jacob for giving him that coat, because they have made millions out of that coat. But Joseph's brothers didn't appreciate it at all. They were very jealous. They were very envious indeed. If you were to do what I did earlier on this week and get your red biro out and underline the word hatred every time it appears in Genesis chapter 27, you will do a lot of underlining. Verse 4, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. That's proper hatred, isn't it? That is real hatred. You can't speak a kind word to someone, and this is their brother. And then God gave Joseph those two dreams. Date-wise, we are probably something like 1600 BC. God had not yet caused the scriptures to be written, and so God revealed something of his plans to Joseph by dreams. There were those two dreams. The first dream, Joseph and his brothers are in the fields binding sheaths of corn, and Joseph's sheath rose and stood upright, and the brothers' sheaves gathered around and bowed. Second dream, the sun, the moon, the stars bowing before Joseph. And the meaning of those dreams, was clear to the brothers. God was going to raise up Joseph as a ruler, and he would rule over them. And the meaning of those dreams is even clearer to us because we know how the story ends. We know that Joseph became ruler of the whole country of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. We know that Joseph became the way that God saved maybe millions of people from death because of the famine and Joseph's stewardship of the resources in the 7 years of plenty. We know that eventually actually the brothers would willingly and gladly and joyfully accept Joseph's rule, and as a result would themselves escape from death by starvation. But for the moment, you rule over us? We don't think so. We'd rather murder you than bow down to you. But of course, Joseph's dream was not Joseph's dream. Joseph's dream was actually God's dream. Joseph's words in telling his brothers about the dream were God's words, God's intention, God's plan that he had revealed. Hence my second heading. God's revealed word flouted again. This is the story of the Bible, isn't it? It is, in one sense, desperately repetitive. God speaks and people say, we don't think so. We know best. We don't want you telling us what to do. 1600 years after Joseph, another man appears and also says, I am God's appointed ruler. And men and women said, no, we don't think so. We'd rather murder you than bow down to you. Which of course is what they did. They crucified him. This is what people do. And if I'm honest with myself and I'm honest with you, this is what I am often tempted to do. Often. And more often than I would like to admit, I do not resist that temptation, and as a consequence, I flout God's revealed word. Because I don't want to obey. Because I think I know better. God's cosmic plan, 1 millimetre in. God's revealed word flouted again. My third heading, God's power over everything. The good things, the bad things. And just to clarify what I'm saying, God really, 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 really is in charge, whether I know it or not. God's cosmic plan involves Joseph. And the brothers say, no, we don't think so. So what did God do? Trinity Sunday. So back in heaven, what did God do? Did the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit call a family meeting together between the three of them and say, well, that didn't go very well, did it? The brothers don't think it's a very good idea. We better think something else up. Over their coffee together, did they say, well, we had planned for Joseph to be ruler in Egypt? Who would teach people in advance about one of us, about Jesus, who one day would go down to earth. We planned that. We planned to raise up a huge nation of Abraham's descendants in Egypt that eventually we would rescue and take them to their own land. But the brothers are going to kill him. So that's not going to work, is it? We're a bit stuffed, aren't we? Is that what happened? Is that what they said to each other? That of course is a million miles away from what happened. Who is in charge here? God is in charge here. And what he says goes. Joseph is going to be his appointed ruler. Now, can I ask you just to notice two things in chapter 37? Firstly, and this might be a slight surprise, firstly, God is not mentioned once in this chapter. Did you spot that? God is not mentioned once, not once. But secondly, will you notice that lots of people do lots of different things in this chapter? People do good things, people do evil things. But by the end of the chapter, lo and behold, Joseph is not dead. Lo and behold, Joseph is actually on his way to Egypt, where one day he would rule. So even though God is not mentioned, God's power over everything, the good things and the bad things, is clearly visible. God really, really, really is in charge. Let me just remind you of the storyline from verse 12. The brothers, they have gone quite some distance away to graze their sheep. They've gone for quite a while. So Jacob, Dad, sends Joseph to make sure that everything's okay. Then there are three whole verses, verses 15, 16 and 17. There are three whole verses devoted to this curious little story about how Joseph can't find them, and a stranger who just happens to be there directs them to Dothan, which is something like 30 miles away. Dothan, which just happens to be on a trade route. As we've seen, the brothers wanted to kill him, but Reuben, the eldest brother, makes a half-hearted attempt at rescuing Joseph and has him thrown into a pit. And this just happens to delay proceedings, and then it just happens at that moment that a group of merchants pass by, and where were they going? Or they just happened to be going to Egypt. And so Judah, another son, just happens to have a brainwave. Let's sell him as a slave instead. Let's sell him for pieces of silver. And as a complete aside, our New Testament eyes sort of light up slightly and we think, gosh, yes, 1600 years later, there's someone else who would be betrayed by pieces of silver. All these things just happen. And as a result, we do see, don't we, God's power over everything. The good things, the bad things. God really, really, really is in charge, whether I know it or not. I don't want to labour this, but can I just pick up on just two of those events? The stranger. 3 verses devoted to this stranger. That tells me it is significant. Just think about how God planned for that moment. How God planned for that meeting. What did God have to do in order for that sequence to happen? Well, God had to put that stranger in that place days earlier. He had to cause that stranger to ask the brothers, where are you going? And days later, he had to cause the stranger to encounter Joseph at exactly the right moment. But actually, it's even more wonderful than that, because actually he had to create this stranger in the first place. And create his parents. And I am using a euphemism here, he had to cause those parents to get together and connect at the exact split second necessary to produce this child with his unique DNA, his unique character that would have influenced his life all along in such a way that he ended up in exactly the right spot to the minute. This stranger had freely chosen to be at this place at this moment in time. But behind all of that, God had planned for it to work out this way. Or if I use the word that the Bible writers use a lot later on, God predestined this would happen. Now we get a bit anxious about predestination because we somehow think it makes us sound like puppets. But no one in this story is presented like a puppet. They all know exactly what they're doing. They all make free choices. But we see that behind all these free choices, God really is in charge. Very briefly, Simeon. Let's sell him into slavery. A despicable suggestion. Marginally better than let's kill him, but not much better. Let's sell our brother as a slave. We hate him so much. And that decision ended up with Joseph staying alive and ending up on his way to Egypt. God's power over everything. God's power over the good things and the bad things. God's power even over the bad things. God really is in charge, whether I know it or not. And 1600 years later, I put a reference down there, Acts 4:28, do look at it later. Herod, Pilate, the whole of Israel freely and despicably chose to crucify Jesus. They thought they were in charge. But God was the one who was in charge. All of this was part of his cosmic plan, initially revealed all those years ago in Abraham. My final two headings, somewhat more briefly. An encouragement to holiness, an encouragement not to despair. So firstly, an encouragement to holiness. I guess we do want to say, don't we, we must follow God and his ways because he commands us to. But we can also say we must follow God and his ways because his ways really are best. This is a very sorry chapter, isn't it? This is a very sinful chapter. And it is a chapter that shows us the devastating consequences of saying to God, no, I'm not going to follow your good ways. Let's just think for a second about each of those main characters by the end of chapter 37. The brothers was Reuben. We're told he doesn't know what to do following Joseph's sale to slavery. Where can I turn now, he says. Reuben gets a glimpse of the horror that they have caused. And then all of them, what do they do next? Well, what can they do? Well, they feel the only thing they can do is manufacture this web of deceit and lies they have to live with and perpetuate virtually forever, with the goat and the cloak. Goat and the cloak, dipping the cloak in the goat, saying to Dad, no, must have been a wild animal, something like that. The guilt they felt. The guilt they would feel not only whenever they remembered Joseph, but every time they looked their dad in the face. And Dad, Jacob, he is literally inconsolable. I'll never get over this, he says. And Joseph, he was 17. He was 17. He was a lad, carted off to slavery in a foreign country. That's terrifying, isn't it? Doesn't this encourage you to live holy lives? It encourages me to live a holy life. Some of God's ways, I confess, I don't understand. But I do understand I don't want to end up like these brothers. I don't want to be the sort of person that causes the devastation that these brothers caused. The particular sin we see here of hatred and envy and looking down on others and being overly critical of others and being superior of others. there is in me that occasional desire just to be nasty. And it just starts off in my mind. But if I'm not very careful, there is that tendency for it to spill over into my words and my actions and my texts and my emails and what I write on social media. No, I will not be like that. I will not be like that. I will not start down the route these brothers started down. An encouragement to holiness. But finally, an encouragement not to despair. The encouragement not to despair comes from the rest of the Genesis, comes from the rest of the Bible. These evil acts, these evil men. But God is greater than these evil acts. God is greater than these evil men. And so when people do harm to me, when people do hurt me by their words, by their actions, by their emails, by their texts, by what they write about me on social media, when things in life hurt me, whether it's an accident or whether it's an illness or whether it's loss of my job or real financial difficulties or relationship failures or anything else that happens to me that I would not have chosen, when I turn on the news and I see unspeakable things, unspeakable tragedy on the Mediterranean that no one, frankly, has the beginning of an answer for, I do not need to despair. I tell myself I will not despair. Why? Because Genesis 37 tells me, Genesis 37 reassures me that God really, really, really is in charge. God has an amazing cosmic plan. And God is working all things. God is working all things. God is working all things together for his good purposes.